Scott Eastwood's story is one of pain, struggle, rejection, and perseverance. He may carry one of the most famous last names in Hollywood, but his journey has been anything but privileged. From the day he was born, his life was marked by secrecy, distance, and an endless effort to prove himself without the help of his father, Clint Eastwood. Imagine auditioning for nearly every movie your father makes, only to get rejected each time. That was Scott's reality. Even when Clint directed huge projects like American Sniper, Scott wasn't given a role. While his father collected Oscars and directed award-winning films, Scott was parking cars, mixing drinks, and working construction jobs just to pay his bills. At one point, he admitted he made more money bartending than acting, and by the time he turned 35, he was so discouraged by Hollywood that he even considered leaving it all behind to become a firefighter. But the most difficult and shocking parts of his story weren't just about his career, they were also about his relationship with his father and the personal losses he endured along the way. Scott Clinton Reeves was born on March 21, 1986, in Monterey, California. His birth didn't make headlines, and it wasn't celebrated publicly. In fact, his father, Clint Eastwood, didn't even acknowledge him openly at first. At the time, Clint was already a legendary name in Hollywood, both as a leading man and as a director. While he was standing proudly on red carpets, Scott's life quietly began in the shadows of secrecy and scandal. His mother, Jacelyn Reeves, was a flight attendant who met Clint during his travels in the mid-1980s. What followed was a secret affair that lasted at least 3 years. During those years, Clint was publicly in a relationship with actress Sondra Locke, who had no idea about the double life Clint was living. Locke believed they were exclusive, but she later discovered the truth about Scott and his younger sister Catherine during a bitter legal battle years later. When Scott was born, his birth certificate didn't even carry the Eastwood name. Instead, it read Scott Clinton Reeves, a quiet attempt to keep the affair hidden. 2 years later, in 1988, his sister Catherine was born. By then, the secret had stretched too far, and eventually, the truth surfaced. But Clint still didn't openly acknowledge them, and he certainly didn't raise them. Scott spent his early years in Carmel by the Sea, the same small California town where Clint once served as mayor. But while his father was making millions, Scott's life looked very different. His world wasn't filled with luxury, fame, or attention. When Scott was 10 years old, Jacelyn moved him and Catherine to Hawaii. It wasn't just a new home, it was a way to put thousands of miles between them and the Eastwood spotlight. In Hawaii, Scott grew up in modest surroundings. His classmates never questioned his life because they didn't know he was the son of one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Clint remained distant, rarely present in Scott's day-to-day life. While Clint continued building his fortune, Scott and his sister lived off their mother's flight attendant salary. As a teenager, Scott worked construction jobs, waited tables, and did whatever it took to make ends meet. When he went to Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, he studied communications but still paid his own way through school. There was no trust fund, no financial safety net. He took acting classes, auditioned for small roles, and went by the name Scott Reeves instead of Eastwood. He didn't want to be seen as a privileged kid riding on his father's fame. He wanted to earn respect on his own. But rejection became his constant companion. He later admitted he auditioned for almost every one of his father's films, but Clint never cast him. Even when Clint directed American Sniper, a massive box office success that made over $547 million and earned 6 Oscar nominations, Scott didn't get a role. Clint's philosophy was simple: no handouts, no favors. You either earned it yourself or not at all. This might sound admirable, but for Scott, it meant years of being ignored by the industry while his father continued winning awards. His early roles were so small that they were almost invisible. In 2006, Clint directed Flags of Our Fathers, and Scott appeared in a tiny role as Private Roberto Lunsford, credited under the name Scott Reeves. No one knew he was Clint's son, and that was how Scott wanted it. But it came at a cost. Without attention, recognition, or momentum, he was stuck in small independent films that barely made it to theaters. Some went straight to video. He worked endlessly, but his career seemed to go nowhere. Scott's family life was complicated too. Clint Eastwood had 8 children with 6 different women. Scott was just one part of a messy and fragmented family tree. Some of his half-siblings grew up with wealth and privilege, while others, like Scott and Catherine, did not. Some of them didn't even meet each other until adulthood, and when they did, gatherings were awkward. Resentment was always in the air. Scott, meanwhile, struggled during his teenage years. Living in Hawaii, he got into fights, was suspended from school, and later admitted that he had serious anger issues. He knew who his father was, but he couldn't talk about it. He couldn't ask why Clint was absent from his life or explain to others why he felt both important and invisible at the same time. When the family moved back to California in 2000, Scott enrolled in Carmel High School. Slowly, the truth about who he was began to spread. Some classmates treated him differently, almost like royalty. Others mocked him for it. He even considered keeping the name Reeves forever just to escape the constant comparisons to his father. By college, though, he stopped hiding. He was ready to pursue acting openly, but he still refused to lean on Clint's influence. He applied for financial aid, worked long hours, and accepted small acting jobs that paid very little. Things finally started to shift in 2009 when Scott landed a role in Clint's film Invictus. This time, he didn't hide behind the name Reeves, he used Eastwood. The film was about proving yourself under pressure, something Scott could deeply relate to. It wasn't a huge role, but it was the beginning of something bigger. A few years later, in 2011, Scott signed on to appear in 3 horror films, including Texas Chainsaw 3D. At that time, he was still using the name Scott Reeves, hoping to avoid being branded as just Clint's kid. Even though he hadn't even seen the original 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he stepped into the iconic franchise. The film ended up being the 7th installment and became part of horror movie history. Then, in 2014, came a turning point. Scott landed a role in Fury, a gritty World War II drama starring Brad Pitt, Shia LaBeouf, and Jon Bernthal. This time, Scott wasn't just in the background. He played Sergeant Miles, the newest soldier in the tank crew. To prepare, he went through intense military training and even operated real Sherman tanks from the 1940s. The cast ended up winning the National Board of Review's Best Ensemble Award, and for the first time, critics began to call Scott a real actor instead of just Clint Eastwood's son. The following year, in 2015, he took another leap by starring in The Longest Ride, a romantic drama based on a Nicholas Sparks novel. Scott played a bull rider who falls in love, and to make the role authentic, he even did his own bull riding stunts. The film gained attention, and Scott was nominated for Choice Movie Breakout Star. Suddenly, studios started to see him differently. Later that same year, he shocked everyone by appearing as the romantic lead in Taylor Swift's Wildest Dreams music video. Directed by Joseph Kahn, the video was cinematic, sensual, and filled with sweeping African landscapes. While some in the industry warned him not to do it, fearing it would hurt his credibility, Scott didn't care. He went for it, and the video became a huge success, launching during the MTV VMAs and racking up millions of views. But behind the success, Scott was hiding a devastating secret. In 2014, his girlfriend, Jewel Brangman, died in a car accident. She was only 26 years old. The crash itself wasn't even severe, it was the kind of accident most people walk away from. But Jewel didn't. She died instantly, and Scott never spoke about it publicly for almost 3 years. When he finally revealed the truth in a 2017 interview with GQ Australia, it was heartbreaking. Jewel had been driving a rental car, a 2001 Honda Civic, from San Diego to Los Angeles. She lightly rear-ended another vehicle in a small chain reaction crash. It should have been minor. No one else was seriously injured. But Jewel's car had a hidden danger. Its airbag had been recalled back in 2009, but the rental company never fixed it. When it deployed, instead of saving her life, it killed her. The chemical inside had become unstable, and the metal canister exploded. A piece of shrapnel tore through her neck and split her spine. That single piece of flying metal ended her life. The defective airbags came from Takata, a company whose products were later recalled in over 24 million cars in the United States. It became the largest automotive recall in American history. But for Jewel, the recall came too late. Her father, Alexander Brangman, was devastated. Jewel was his only child, his best friend. Just 3 months before her death, she had given him a Father's Day card saying she'd always be his little girl. Losing her shattered him. For Scott, the tragedy was life-changing. He said he had lost friends before, but never someone he loved that deeply. Losing Jewel made him more guarded, less trusting, and made dating much harder. 4 years, he didn't even reach out to her father to talk about the grief they both carried. The silence haunted him, and when he finally shared the story publicly, it revealed just how much pain he had been hiding behind his rising Hollywood career. Scott Eastwood's journey has been filled with rejection, resilience, and heartbreak. He has lived in the shadow of one of Hollywood's greatest legends, constantly working to prove he isn't just Clint Eastwood's son. He's endured years of struggling with rejection, small roles, and financial hardship, all while carrying the weight of personal loss. But through it all, he has kept going, refusing to give up even when it seemed easier to walk away. His story isn't just about being the son of a famous man. It's about the struggle of forging your own identity, surviving heartbreak, and finding strength in the face of rejection and tragedy. Scott Eastwood's career began to take new turns after the pain he carried from losing Jewel. He admitted that the tragedy left a permanent mark on his heart and changed the way he looked at life. Before, he had always been eager to push forward, to keep auditioning and working without thinking about tomorrow. But after her death, he realized how fragile life really was. He became more reflective, more careful, and in many ways, more determined to live fully. He said in interviews that losing her reminded him to never take anything for granted. Professionally, though, the climb was still difficult. He had the looks of a movie star, the last name of Hollywood royalty, and a growing list of credits, but breaking into the top tier of Hollywood actors wasn't easy. Many directors were cautious. Some feared casting him because they thought the audience would only see Clint Eastwood's son on screen instead of Scott the actor. Others assumed that because he was Clint's child, he must have been handed every opportunity. Ironically, the opposite was true. Clint never opened doors for him, leaving Scott to constantly prove that he belonged in the industry on his own terms. After his breakout years around 2014 and 2015, more roles started to appear. In 2016, Scott joined the Fast and Furious franchise with The Fate of the Furious. The franchise was one of the biggest in the world, bringing him into an ensemble filled with stars like Vin Diesel, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and Charlize Theron. His role as Little Nobody, a government agent, wasn't huge, but it placed him in a massive global blockbuster. For the first time, millions of fans around the world saw his face, and his name began to circulate in a much bigger way. That same year, he also appeared in Suicide Squad, part of the DC Comics extended universe. Playing GQ Edwards, a Navy SEAL working with the Suicide Squad, Scott found himself sharing the screen with actors like Will Smith, Margot Robbie, and Jared Leto. Even though the film received mixed reviews, it was a financial success and exposed him to another worldwide audience. With these films, Scott officially entered the world of big-budget franchises, something he had dreamed of during his years of struggle. But he still faced the same challenge. People didn't know if they should take him seriously. Was he just another handsome face Hollywood wanted to push, or was he someone who could carry a story with depth and emotion? To prove himself, he continued taking on roles in smaller projects while balancing bigger films. He knew that in Hollywood, one strong performance could change everything, and he was waiting for that defining role. What made Scott different from many of his peers was his willingness to do things the hard way. He didn't mind the physical demands of roles, whether it was bull riding, tank training, or military-style boot camps. He loved performing his own stunts and pushed himself to experience the reality of the characters he played. This discipline came partly from growing up without privilege. Since he had worked construction jobs, parked cars, and bartended just to pay his bills, he didn't have the same sense of entitlement that some star kids did. He was used to sweating, working long hours, and earning everything he had. His relationship with Clint remained complicated. On one hand, Clint's refusal to help him get roles may have built Scott into a tougher and more independent man. On the other hand, it left him feeling abandoned and unwanted at times. He has admitted in interviews that auditioning for his father's films and getting rejected was painful. All he wanted was a chance, not a guaranteed role. But Clint's old-school philosophy of tough love left no room for favoritism. For Clint, giving Scott an easy opportunity would have been a betrayal of the merit-based system he believed in. Yet for Scott, it meant years of feeling like he wasn't good enough, even in his father's eyes. Outside of acting, Scott found healing in the ocean. He became a passionate surfer, spending much of his free time riding waves in California and Hawaii. Surfing gave him peace, a way to clear his head from the stress of Hollywood and the grief he carried. He often said that being in the water reminded him of how small he was compared to the world around him, and that gave him perspective. It was in those moments of solitude, away from cameras and casting calls, that he felt most like himself. In his personal life, the loss of Jewel lingered. For years, he struggled to open up in relationships. Friends said he had built walls around himself, not wanting to risk that kind of heartbreak again. When he finally spoke about her death publicly, it was as if he was releasing a secret that had been eating away at him. He revealed details of the accident that horrified people. The fact that such a minor crash could kill someone simply because of a defective airbag was almost unthinkable. Jewel's death became part of a much bigger story, one that revealed the danger of corporate negligence and led to greater awareness about vehicle safety recalls. But for Scott, it was deeply personal. Every time he heard about another Takata airbag-related death, it was like reliving his own tragedy. Despite the heartbreak, Scott kept pushing forward in Hollywood. He appeared in films like Pacific Rim, Uprising in 2018, stepping into another major action franchise. While the movie didn't perform as strongly as expected, his presence in it proved that studios trusted him with large-scale projects. At the same time, he continued exploring smaller, character-driven roles, hoping to find the balance between blockbuster fame and artistic respect. As he got older, he began reflecting more on the meaning of legacy. Carrying the Eastwood name was both a blessing and a curse. It opened some doors simply because people were curious, but it also came with the pressure of living up to Clint's legendary reputation. Scott often said he didn't want to copy his father, nor did he want to escape his shadow entirely. Instead, he wanted to build something of his own. He admired Clint's work ethic, discipline, and vision as a filmmaker, but he wanted his career to tell a different story, one of resilience, humility, and individuality. Scott also started producing and looking at projects from behind the camera. Watching Clint direct had given him an inside view of how films were made, and he wanted to use that knowledge to create opportunities for himself and others. He understood that waiting for Hollywood to hand him the perfect role wasn't realistic. Instead, he had to shape his own path, just as Clint had done decades earlier. Through all of this, Scott's bond with his half-siblings slowly grew stronger. Though the Eastwood family had always been complicated, some of the siblings began finding common ground as adults. They understood better than anyone the challenges of growing up with Clint as their father, a man who was both distant and larger than life. While some had experienced privilege and others had not, they shared the same mix of admiration and frustration toward the man who connected them. For Scott, building those sibling relationships helped him feel less alone in carrying the Eastwood name. By his mid-30s, Scott was no longer the struggling actor parking cars and bartending to survive. He was a working Hollywood star with blockbuster credits, magazine covers, and millions of fans worldwide. But beneath the surface, he was still the same man who had fought for every opportunity, who had endured countless rejections, and who had carried heartbreak that reshaped his life. His story wasn't about overnight fame or an easy ride through Hollywood. It was about persistence, the kind that comes from being told no over and over again but refusing to give up. What makes Scott's journey so powerful is that it reflects the truth behind so many Hollywood success stories. Fame often looks glamorous from the outside, but behind the lights and cameras are years of struggle, doubt, and pain. For Scott, the road was even harder because he had to fight the shadow of his own father, a man who defined American cinema for decades. Yet, instead of breaking under that pressure, Scott kept climbing, slowly building a career that was his and his alone. Today, Scott Eastwood continues to act, produce, and pursue projects that challenge him. He still surfs, still seeks peace in the ocean, and still carries the memory of Jewel with him. His journey is ongoing, but the lessons he has learned are already clear. Life isn't about the name you carry or the opportunities you're handed. It's about what you do with rejection, how you rise from heartbreak, and the determination you show when no one else believes in you. Scott's life has been filled with shadows of secrecy, of rejection, of tragedy. But in every shadow, he has found a way to carve out light. That light is his identity, his resilience, and his refusal to quit. And while his story began as Clint Eastwood's hidden son, it has grown into something much larger, the story of a man who fought for his place in the world, not through privilege, but through perseverance. Scott Eastwood's story is a mix of pain, growth, survival, and a constant search for identity beyond the shadow of his legendary father. In 2017, he admitted something that revealed the depth of his struggle. He said he still hadn't found the right words. The words he was talking about were the ones he never spoke to Jewel's father after her tragic death. Jewel had been his girlfriend, and her passing in a car accident left wounds that never fully healed. Her father wanted answers, wanted the world to know how much she had been loved, but Scott stayed silent. His silence wasn't strength, it was paralysis. When he finally spoke years later, it became clear he wasn't healed. He was still broken inside, still carrying not just grief but guilt. He never reached out, never called her father, never gave the comfort that a grieving parent was desperately seeking. That guilt followed him, heavier than any loss. He described it as more than grief, it was shame, survivor's guilt, fear, and emotional paralysis all tangled together. He didn't know how to face a father who had lost everything, so he chose silence, and that silence haunted him. But Scott's story isn't only about heartbreak and silence. Long before that moment, before Jewel's death, he had found another kind of guidance through someone who would also be taken from him too soon, Paul Walker. Paul wasn't just a co-star from the Fast and Furious world, he was like a big brother. Paul had introduced Scott to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in 2007, and that single introduction would later become one of the biggest sources of strength in his life. For Paul, Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just about training, fitness, or combat, it was a way of life. He trained under top names, turned part of his home in Hawaii into a training space, and built his life around the discipline and philosophy of the sport. Paul was already a brown belt when he died in 2013, and just 2 weeks after his tragic accident, his instructors honored him by awarding his black belt posthumously. Scott took that gift seriously. He didn't just train for fun, he embraced jiu-jitsu like a lifeline. He said it taught him to control his ego, to stay humble, and most importantly, to handle pain, not just the physical pain of the mat but the deep emotional pain of life. He explained it simply, you choke some people out, and some people choke you out. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've achieved, or what name you carry in Hollywood on the mat, everyone is equal, and you have to earn everything. For Scott, who grew up in the massive shadow of Clint Eastwood, that lesson was crucial. Jiu-jitsu stripped away the weight of expectations. It reminded him he was not untouchable, and that was strangely freeing. It gave him a safe place to fail, to reset, to rebuild himself. Joe Rogan once explained why jiu-jitsu was so powerful, especially for men. He said it allows them to release emotions, to stop pretending, and to confront fear and anger without violence. It humbles you, and it calms you down. For Scott, this was exactly what he needed after Jewel's death. Jiu-jitsu became more than exercise, it became therapy. He kept showing up to train even on the days he didn't feel like it. That discipline became his anchor. Every time he stepped onto the mat, he honored Paul Walker, and every time he got back up, he honored Jewel. In a very real way, Paul had saved Scott twice, once by introducing him to the sport and again by giving him the tools to survive after unimaginable loss. Scott wasn't content to only be Clint Eastwood's son. He wanted to create his own path. That opportunity came in 2017 when he joined the Fast and Furious franchise as Little Nobody, a sharp-suited government agent designed to help fill the void left by Paul Walker's absence. Scott didn't try to copy Paul, he brought his own steel and wit to the role. The character had honor, loved fast cars, and held his ground against Vin Diesel's crew. The franchise was already one of the biggest in the world, with over $6 billion in earnings, and it gave Scott instant global recognition. It wasn't just a cameo role either. His character played a key part in hunting down the villain Cypher, proving Scott could stand tall among larger-than-life stars. In 2018, Scott took an even bigger step with Pacific Rim Uprising. The movie was packed with robots, monsters, explosions, and heavy visual effects. It was a true test of whether Scott could hold his ground in a blockbuster filled with CGI chaos, and he delivered. The movie made $291 million worldwide, and even though critics weren't overly impressed, Scott proved he could carry himself in the thick of massive productions. Then in 2019, he switched gears completely with The Outpost. Unlike the glossy blockbusters, this was raw and real, a story about soldiers trapped in one of the most dangerous battles of the Afghanistan war. It wasn't about heroics, but about survival, fear, and humanity. Critics loved it, veterans praised its authenticity, and audiences were moved by his performance. At one point in the film, he muttered the line, "No, not today," and critics noted he sounded exactly like his father in his younger years. But this wasn't about being Clint's son. This was Scott proving he could truly act. By 2023, he returned to the Fast franchise in Fast X. Fans had missed him in F9, but now he was back stronger. With Mr. Nobody missing, Little Nobody stepped into a more central role. The cast was stacked with names like Vin Diesel, Jason Momoa, and Brie Larson, but Scott didn't fade into the background. The story hinted that his role was only going to grow more important, setting him up as a key figure for the future of the franchise. Then in 2025, he made his boldest move yet with Alarm. This wasn't just another action film, it was a showdown with Sylvester Stallone, directed by Michael Polish. The story of two ex-spies dragged back into chaos tested Scott against one of the greatest action legends of all time. Watching them together felt like a passing of the torch from Stallone's generation to Eastwood's. Scott didn't just hold his ground, he matched Stallone move for move. Outside of acting, Scott was building something even more personal. In 2019, he co-founded the clothing brand Made Here with entrepreneur Dane Chapin. This wasn't just another celebrity fashion line. It was built on a patriotic mission, proving that American-made products still matter. The brand started small with basics like t-shirts, socks, and boxers, but every product was made in the US, not outsourced overseas. Scott wasn't just a face for the brand, he was deeply involved, down to the fit of the shirts. For him, it was about pride, about proving that American workers could still create quality products if given the chance. Each product carried a story of the workers who made it. It wasn't about chasing trends, it was about creating a movement. He said their current line was just the beginning, with plans to expand while keeping everything American-made. Scott's values didn't come from nowhere. Growing up with Clint Eastwood as a father shaped him in tough ways. His childhood wasn't normal. When he was 16, he made a mistake that taught him a lesson he'd never forget. He took his 14-year-old sister to a party and left her there alone. When Clint found out, he didn't sit him down for a talk, he grabbed Scott, slammed him against the wall, punched him in the face, and told him one thing: you never leave your sister at a party. Ever. It was harsh, but Scott never forgot it. Clint raised him with tough love. There were no handouts, no easy rides. When Scott asked for $8,000 to buy a truck, Clint simply said no. Scott had a job, he was earning money, and if he wanted a truck, he had to figure it out himself. That kind of upbringing taught him discipline, responsibility, and grit. One of the biggest career decisions came in 2022 when Warner Brothers offered Scott a 3-picture deal, including a role in The Suicide Squad. It was a dream offer for most actors, big money, big exposure, but Scott turned it down. He didn't like the contract, didn't like the uncertainty, and didn't feel respected. He told his father, and Clint's advice was simple: if it feels right, do it. If it doesn't, walk away. Scott walked away, proving he was building his career on instinct and respect, not just fame. Now, with Clint at 94, Scott treasures the stories his father tells about Sinatra, old Hollywood, wild adventures, and movie sets that shaped an era. Scott knows Clint won't be around forever, so he listens carefully, collecting not just advice but pieces of history. He remembers moments like flying in a helicopter with his father up the California coast, learning what real focus and fearlessness looked like. Those lessons are now part of who he is. Scott's upcoming projects show how far he's come. In Regretting You, based on Colleen Hoover's novel, he stars alongside Allison Williams and Dave Franco in a deeply emotional story about family, tragedy, and secrets. He knows Hoover's fanbase is powerful, and this film could launch him into a new level of stardom. In Stolen Girl, based on the true story of a mother fighting to recover her child taken to the Middle East, Scott plays a man helping in the search. Filmed in Italy with Kate Beckinsale, it's gritty, heartbreaking, and very real. He's also starring in Lucky Strike, a World War II story about survival during the Battle of the Bulge, directed by Rod Lurie. And in Wind River, the next chapter, he joins a chilling sequel about ritualistic murders on Native American land, diving into dark and layered storytelling. But even as his career rises, Scott admits Hollywood hasn't been easy. In 2022, he confessed that the industry had burned him more than once, and he wasn't sure he wanted to keep doing it into his 40s. His early years were far from glamorous, working construction, bartending, parking cars, making $30,000 to $40,000 a year, often earning more mixing drinks than acting. At one point, he seriously considered quitting acting and becoming a firefighter. That wasn't just a passing idea, it was a backup plan he truly thought about. Hollywood was draining, unpredictable, and filled with rejection. He wanted a family someday, and he wasn't sure if this life was the one he wanted to build it in. Through all of it, one thing stayed constant: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The sport Paul Walker had introduced him to became his anchor, his therapy, and his way to stay grounded in a business designed to knock people down. On the mat, there was no fame, no Hollywood privilege, just truth. Jiu-Jitsu reminded him that ego doesn't matter, that resilience does. He once said that the best jiu-jitsu guys he met were also the most humble, the most grounded, and the most real people he'd ever known. That is what keeps him balanced, no matter how heavy the weight of his name, his past, or his future becomes.